Imagine listening to the sound of your heart as you were being led to your death, or the fear that lives inside you every day because you don't know when your time is up. This is the torment that inmates on death row live with. According to the Death Penalty Information Center, there have been 1,453 executions since 1976, with 11 having already been killed in the first 5 months of 2017. On average, that is about 35 deaths per year. Moreover, there were 20 executions in 2016, and there were 166 exonerations within that year. One of the most contentious issues with the death penalty debate is race. It is no longer black and white justice, it is black or white justice. The Balda study proves a defendant is more likely to be found guilty if they kill a white person than if they kill a person of color. Death sentences resulted in 21% of cases involving black defendants and white victims, but only 8% of cases were with white defendants and white victims. 96% of states where studies have examined race and the death penalty have found patterns of discrimination. It is 4.3 times more likely for a defendant to be charged with killing a white rather than a black victim. Currently, there are 31 states in the United States of America that allow the death penalty and the U.S. government and military. Of the remaining states and the District of Columbia, the death penalty has been abolished. Michigan was the first to abolish it in 1846, and Maryland is the last to abolish it since 2013. However, there is a government-imposed moratorium on the death penalty in Colorado, Oregon, Pennsylvania, and Washington. The 5 methods of execution are hanging, lethal injection, electrocution, gas chamber, or by firing squad.
Please don't make me. No, I don't.
I think that our work has had a profound effect on perceptions of capital punishment by everyone in the United States and, frankly, across the world. It's just extraordinary. Nobody ever believed that there was this great a risk of convicting an innocent person, much less executing them. And now the risk of wrongful conviction and execution has been established is much higher than anybody believed. And the debate now about capital punishment in the United States has changed. It's not just a moral issue for people, because reasonable people can differ as to whether the death penalty is a morally appropriate sanction for the most heinous of crimes. But nobody believes that you ought to execute an innocent person. That's a non-starter as a moral question. And now we know that that's a significant risk, so that's point one.
George Stinney was just 14 years old when he was executed for the murders of 2 young white girls, which he was exonerated for 70 years later. He was wrongly interrogated, and the death sentence took only 10 minutes to deliberate. His sister Amy Ruffner, his alibi, was never able to testify on her brother's behalf. Here she is years later, reopening his case to seek justice.
Please, can we go?
Point two, and the National Academy of Sciences just recently produced another report on this. There's no sound proof that this deters. Capital punishment does not deter. Just take the state of California. In the state of California, it takes 26 years between a death sentence and an execution. They've had very few executions in the state. Most people die of old age in prisons. Now, how does that help family members of a murder victim who want closure, if you believe that it really does bring closure? Some do, some don't. But 26 years? If you believe it deters, although the evidence is clear it doesn't, how do you get deterrence if it takes 26 years? Even if you're one of those people that believes in retribution, it's a morally appropriate sanction, if it's not instituted for 26 years, it's not achieving anybody's purpose.
Deterrence means that we can execute people to send a message to others. After a while, increases in the severity of punishment have decreasing incremental deterrent effects. So if you haven't deterred somebody by life, you're not going to deter them by death. If the death penalty deterred crime, we would see homicide rates falling. However, we see the opposite. Crime rates are higher where more executions take place.
And it's also incredibly expensive. So in the state of California, they estimate over the next 5 years it would cost them $1 billion to continue with the death penalty. So we now have on the ballot in the state of California a referendum to repeal capital punishment in that state. And you know, the campaign is led by Gina Whitford, who was the warden at San Quentin, who presided over executions, who was once head of the Department of Corrections in the state of California. The individual who brought the referendum years ago was the sponsor of it, now says it was a terrible mistake. You know, capital punishment judges are saying this system is broken, we should support the referendum and repeal it. Just in the last 5 years, state after state, the state legislatures have said, look, it's not an issue of whether you think capital punishment is a morally appropriate sanction, because if you do public opinion polling, 65% of the people believe that, 35% believe it's immoral for the state to kill. But where people are coming together now is the punishment of life without the possibility of parole versus the death penalty. And then all of a sudden the public opinion polling, it's about 50-50. And then if you add in, as in California, the incredible expense of this, and you begin to realize if we put all our money into this capital punishment system that doesn't deter, that can't get things right, that has a risk of executing the innocent, and then you take that money, that criminal justice dollar, and you put it into so many of our innocence reforms, for example, that not only protect the innocent but help law enforcement catch the guilty, whether it's better forensic science or eyewitness reform or videotaping interrogations. We're safer spending that money on these other pursuits rather than on the death penalty, which is so problematic. But if that happens in California, after you have this whole trend of 5 states in 5 years, and then California, there are a number of other states that are on the verge. The governor of Oregon has said he thinks the system is broken. He won't execute anybody. So there's quite a few states that I think are in play. And if you get up to 10, 11, you can't just have the death penalty for a few states that are the ones that do the most executions. For Texas or Virginia, you just can't have it for just a few states. And I think under those circumstances, the United States Supreme Court will invalidate it under the 8th Amendment.
The 8th Amendment states, excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. But the populace of the United States argues that an execution by lethal injection, electrocution, hanging, gas chamber, and/or firing squad is very cruel and unusual. Not to mention that 3% of all executions are botched. And lethal injection, the most commonly used method, has the highest botch rate of 7%, which equates to about 97 cases that went wrong total.
Due to the shortage of lethal drugs, states have opted to using myriads of untested drug cocktails. This means that prison employees assisting the executions are experimenting with the drugs to carry out the lethal injection. People are suffering, oftentimes not dying until after at least a half hour. That is undoubtedly cruel and immoral.
In the 1972 Supreme Court case of Furman v. Georgia, the court struck down all existing death penalty laws in a 5-4 decision. They held that the states were handling them in a freakish and wanton manner, and thus was unconstitutional. However, the death penalty in and of itself was not unconstitutional. They banned the death penalty until states could fix their laws. They also established 4 principles to determine if a punishment was cruel and unusual. Is it degrading to human dignity? Is it arbitrary? Is it rejected throughout society? Is it unnecessary? Just 4 years later, in the case of Gregg versus Georgia, 35 states had enacted death penalty statutes in line with the 4 principles established under Furman v. Georgia. So with Gregg versus Georgia, the Supreme Court re-established the death penalty. Years after making this verdict, Justices Powell, Blackmun, and Stevens changed their minds about the death penalty and thinks that it should be abolished. Had they voted in 1976 how they would come to believe, the death penalty would have been abolished over 40 years ago. Not only is the death penalty extremely controversial within the US, but its morality is also questioned internationally. As of 2016, there are 104 countries where the death penalty is not legalized. There are also certain international and regional human rights instruments that specifically commit signatories to end the use of the death penalty. As it stands, it is up to the states to determine the extent of the legality of the death penalty. But this has not stopped organizations such as the National Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty and the International Commission Against Death Penalty from campaigning to make it illegal. Just prior to leaving office, Barack Obama granted clemency to 2 people on death row, becoming the first president to spare someone from execution since 2001.
That we need to take action, and we will, at a time and place.
The current policies in the United States seem to be leaning towards limiting the death penalty as punishment. However, it is still utilized more than what many people would agree with. There are flaws in every justice system, so as long as the death penalty is an option, there is a possibility that innocent people get sentenced to death.
10% of inmates on death row have been exonerated, and 20% have been granted clemency.
We ought to only sentence someone to death for the most egregious offenses. It must be limited to only the most serious crimes and cannot be imposed if a fair trial has not been granted. The crime was not punishable by the death penalty at the time it was committed. The offender is not entitled to seek pardon or a lesser sentence. The offender is under the age of 21. The offender is pregnant, or the court could not come to a unanimous decision. Capital punishment is illegal in 18 states and the District of Columbia. There are only 32 left to join the moral side of justice. Until it is abolished, tighter restrictions must be put in place. The death penalty should be abolished on a federal level. However, as shown throughout history, it will be more feasible to achieve on a state level. It is understood that this change will not happen overnight, but we must continue tightening restrictions until eventually the death penalty ceases to exist. Other countries are pressuring the United States to make such changes, but it cannot happen unless the people put their support behind the cause to abolish capital punishment. If the will of the people is to maintain a just and moral government entity, then the death penalty must be abolished. We must continue our efforts to abolish the death penalty. There has been significant momentum away from the death penalty, and that is because it is morally wrong. Help move society toward more humane justice. As stated by Salil Shetty, the death penalty is a symptom of a culture of violence, not a solution to it.